Right, well, I think we will make a start with some of the housekeeping and bread and butter matters. First of all, welcome everybody who's joined, and welcome also to those who are in the process of joining. This is the final webinar that we have been conducting over the last few weeks on local plan issues. And obviously the topic of this one is viability and the funding of infrastructure. I'm Michael Bedford. Currently I'm head of the planning team at Cornerstone Barristers, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by two of my colleagues, Claire Parry and Wayne Beglin, both of whom are very experienced practitioners and with a wealth of knowledge of the planning system and how to negotiate through the various hurdles that it sometimes presents us with. What we're going to be talking about are a series of topics, and perhaps Claire, if you could just present the next slide, because that just gives us an overview of what we're going to try to cover. We've got a little bit of an introduction from me on the kind of the background to garden communities, and then Claire is going to give us as it were, a refresher and an insight into the current guidance, both in the NPPF and probably more particularly in the PPG that bears on our topics. And then we've got a series of case studies that we're going to look at. Initially, I'm going to say something about experiences at Uttlesford and North Essex, both of which I had some involvement in. And then Wayne Beglin is going to tell us about his experiences, particularly at Dunsfold. That's the Waverley case, which also Claire was involved in there was a High Court challenge, indeed a Court of Appeal challenge in due course in relation to that matter, and then the ongoing position in relation to Tandridge and obviously the South Godstone garden community. Wayne's contribution will be, in a sense, doubly remote since he has had to pre-record his presentation due to being in attendance today remotely at the Welling examination. So we have the privilege of Wayne, as I say, doubly remote today. And then we've got a question and answer session after that. The way that works, we've already, thank you very much, had a number of questions posed by people when they registered, and I'm going to try and pick out some of those to deal with. Many of those points have obviously been very useful in helping us to formulate what we actually wanted to say in the main presentation. But you will also be, no doubt, all as experienced Zoomers, familiar with the Q&A function on your toolbar at the bottom. So you can type in a question. I can't guarantee that we'll be able to pick up on all of the matters, but we will try to pick up on those if we can. I should also say that I think, because we're recording the session, and I think for, as it were, data protection, etc. reasons, it's not practicable to identify individuals with the various questions, because that then goes into all sorts of issues about consent and so on and so forth, and it gets too laborious. So if we talk about things, we'll talk about things, as it were, slightly more anonymously, even though you might well be able to guess where as it were, the direction of the questions are coming from. So that's that on practicalities. And then just, I think, a final housekeeping point, which did pick up, and I think in a little question that we had somebody put in this morning, because we're recording the presentation, it will be available to view via our website in due course. I don't think it's instantaneous, so there may be a bit of a delay in terms of a few days before you can actually get to it online, but you will be able to then access it if for any reason you miss parts of this morning's presentation. So there we are. So let's kick off. Can we go then to the next slide, Claire, just in terms of, as it were, background? And this is more by way of a recap as to, in a sense, why garden communities and therefore the viability and infrastructure issues they present have become so topical. Obviously, you will know that the present government, including its previous iterations going back to the coalition government in 2010, has been of the view that it was the remoteness of what it saw as top-down planning that was fostering a lot of the opposition to growth in local areas. And their view was that what they called localism and making local communities have more of a role in the planning process would be a way to unlock the growth that was seen to have been held back by local opposition. So obviously we know that we had the Localism Act 2011, and we had the associated reforms that went with that, including neighbourhood areas, neighbourhood plans, but without wanting to be too sweeping, it's probably fair to say that experience has shown that those neighbourhood areas which are keen to bring forward neighbourhood plans have more often than not seen that as a way to control and effectively restrict the amount of development coming forward in their localities, rather than seeing it as a way of unleashing development opportunities and changing their environments. The other factor that obviously is a real problem in many areas, if you take existing towns, large villages, and other settlements, over the years, we have experienced what are recognised to be infrastructure deficits, both in terms of physical infrastructure, particularly the highway networks, but also in terms of social and community infrastructure, whether that be in the fields of education, in the fields of community and social and healthcare, or whether it be in the fields of recreational and other social and cultural facilities. And obviously one of the problems that the planning system faces is that you can't readily, as it were, tap a new development and expect it to sort out infrastructure problems that relate to existing issues. Clearly, if development exacerbates a problem, you can expect it to address that exacerbation, and there can, by that route, sometimes be an element of betterment. But what you can't really do is expect new development to sort out existing problems. That's, in a sense, what the national and local taxation systems are there for. And so that consequence, obviously, from local community leaders and plan makers, has imposed something of a check or a restriction on thinking about, however sustainable it might appear in principle, to think about expanding your existing settlements through urban extensions. There are problems if that's not going to really resolve the infrastructure deficits of those areas. And so it then becomes tempting to think about, well, okay, we might not be able to solve those problems in those areas, but obviously if we plan for a new community in a new location, we could expect the development that is going to bring that forward to also bring forward the infrastructure that's needed to support that new community. So that is, again, a driver, I think, as to why we've seen so many areas embracing the idea of bringing forward large-scale growth through garden communities. There's also the issue about democratic accountability and obviously wanting to be responsive to communities. And there is clearly the issue that it may be an unfortunate fact of life, but sometimes the more articulate, the more vocal, and the more engaged communities tend to be those who are established in settlements and settled areas, and obviously there are less of them in simplistic terms in some of the more less developed and more remote rural areas. I have made a brief reference to NIMBYs and bananas, when obviously everybody's familiar with those acronyms, not in my backyard. And then the extension of that, the banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anybody. There's something in that. It's, they are possibly a bit simplistic as headlines, but clearly in terms of minimising opposition to a proposal, there can be a sense in which if you choose somewhere that's far away from, as it were, settled interests, you may get an easier ride in terms of taking that forward. We know that we've tried in the past various iterations, whether we call them new settlements, we've called urban extensions, sustainable urban extensions, SUs. We then had the Eco Towns programme, which really rather fizzled out without delivering any eco towns. But then from a planner's point of view, there's been that long and to an extent valuable history of the garden cities, the garden suburbs, the garden villages, slightly harking back, Ebenezer Howard and Unwin and all of that. But they have been seen to be successful places, and people quite rightly want to celebrate those successes and see if we can capture the essence of those as we move forward, building on the idea that good planning can make great places. And then the final factor, I think, is undoubtedly the fact that MHCLG has given its support, at least in principle, to garden communities through the Garden Communities Programme. It has provided funding to enable proposals to come forward. And so putting all of that together is why you see many local authorities at least thinking that part of the solutions to their problems of addressing housing needs in particular in their plans over the next plan period does involve engaging with, well, why wouldn't a garden community be a way forward in our area to deliver on the infrastructure that's needed, the housing that's needed, and in a way that may be giving us quality places which are able to provide what we need without perhaps quite so much opposition. So that's the kind of context, and that's why we've got these interesting challenges. And I think, Claire, you're going to then just take us through what the NPPF and the PPG say, which are key issues, particularly on that.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. I should say my neighbour has just decided to take a chainsaw to their garden, so if you can hear some strange noises in the background, I'm afraid that's what's going on. So I've been asked to look at the NPPF and the planning practice guidance, specifically with the point of view of whether there's been any change in approach from the NPPF 2012 through to the NPPF 2019 and the associated change in planning practice guidance. And this is particularly important because, as you know, all plans submitted on or prior to the 24th of January of last year are still being examined under the 2012 NPPF. So the impact of changes under the 2019 NPPF to plan making are yet really to come through, particularly in terms of any court challenges. So the NPPF 2019 has a rather stronger support for large-scale extensions. So paragraph 72 provides that a large number of new homes can often be best achieved through planning for larger scale settlement. And we can compare that with the 2012 NPPF, which talked about sometimes be best achieved. And again, the 2019 NPPF says that strategic planning making authorities should identify suitable locations for such development where this can help to meet identified needs in a sustainable way, whereas previously such authorities were simply told they should consider whether such opportunities provide the best ways of achieving sustainable development. So the NPPF itself provides a stronger guide that we should be using these larger scale settlements. Paragraph 72 of the NPPF 2019 subparagraph D goes on to say that planners should make a realistic assessment of likely rates of delivery. But what is of particularly importance to this is it's associated with paragraph footnote 35, and I've done a partial quote from footnote 35 on the slide, but this is a very important footnote in this context, and it provides the delivery of large-scale development may need to extend beyond an individual plan period, and the associated infrastructure requirements may not be capable of being identified fully at the outset. Anticipated rates of delivery and infrastructure requirements should, therefore, be kept under review and reflected as policies are updated. So right from the NPPF, we get a clear guide that people planning for large-scale new settlement extensions may not have all the information that they, at the outset when they're making their plan, and there may be some areas of uncertainty, but that is still acceptable within the context of this large-scale extensions. And that approach is, in my view, very much taken through into the new planning practice guidance. So looking first at the revised local plan planning practice guidance, some of the points that I think are useful to pull out are in terms of the evidence base. The government is very much talking about the use of statements of common ground for responding to infrastructure problems. So they very much anticipate that statements of common ground with infrastructure providers will be a very important part of the evidence base. And that's particularly at paragraph 16, which I've given you the reference to there. There's also throughout the local planning practice guidance, but including in relation to viability, a clear focus on making sure that the evidence base is proportionate and a sort of slight guide away from local authorities doing extensive studies and then having to update those studies. So for example, at paragraph 38 of that guidance, we get phrases like, wherever possible, authorities may wish to prepare evidence in-house or jointly to speed up the process and obtain best value for the taxpayer. We should be doing assessments over similar timescales. Assessments should be proportionate and should not repeat policy assessments that have already been undertaken. And wherever possible, strategic policy making authorities should consider how the preparation of any assessment will contribute to the plan's evidence base. So the government's obviously trying to give plan making authorities some support when they turn up to a local plan hearing and are faced with the usual complaint that their evidence base isn't up to date enough, there's insufficient evidence base. And in particular, that support is carried through into the evidence on viability. So paragraph 48 of the local planning practice guidance talks about policy requirements for developer contributions in relation to viability should be informed by proportionate evidence of infrastructure and affordable housing needs. So we get the reference to proportionality in what we look for in the infrastructure. And there is also very specific reference in the planning practice guidance to uncertainty around infrastructure provision, particularly when we're dealing with larger scale settlements. So at paragraph 59, which I've given you the reference for, which is about how can strategic policy making authorities demonstrate that a plan is capable of delivering strategic matters, including provision for housing and infrastructure. So exactly the point we're discussing. At the end of that paragraph, it says, where plans are looking to plan for longer term growth through new settlements or significant extensions to existing towns and villages, it's recognised there may not be certainty and or the funding secured for necessary strategic infrastructure at the time the plan is produced. In these circumstances, strategic planning making authorities will be expected to demonstrate that there is a reasonable prospect that the proposals can be developed within the timescales envisaged. So that's quite a crucial concept. We're now simply looking for a reasonable prospect that the proposals can be developed. And the way that one goes about showing that there's a reasonable prospect that the proposals can be developed within the timescale are set out at paragraph 60, and some of the types of evidence base that the government discuss in that paragraph include, again, engagement with infrastructure providers, working collaboratively to show that the infrastructure requirements are not beyond what could reasonably be considered to be achievable within the plan timetable. So that's a sort of fairly low threshold that the government are suggesting there. Again, there's talking about use of statements of common ground as part of this evidence base to show that the development can come forward within a reasonable timetable, there's talk about using subsequent plans and plan reviews. So effectively the government's giving some support for the idea that you can say, we don't have all of our evidence around infrastructure at the moment, but when we do our next plan review, we're going to be in a better position. So please let our settlement through now, and the evidence base will grow through the plan reviews. And that can be contrasted quite neatly with the previous approach in the planning practice guidance, which talked more about paying careful attention to providing an adequate supply of land, identifying what infrastructure is required and how it can be funded and brought on stream at the appropriate time, and ensuring that the requirements of the plan as a whole will not prejudice the viability of the development. So it was a much more specific requirement, and it contained no leeway previously for longer scale development in the way that's currently identified. I've just picked out a few points about from the viability planning practice guidance. I won't take much time with this because obviously it's a very detailed document, but there's a certain degree of responsibility placed on site promoters now, and I've given two examples at paragraphs 20 and paragraphs 2 and paragraph 6 of the viability planning practice guidance, which talk about the responsibility on site promoters to engage in plan production and ensure that what is being put forward is both viable and policy compliant. There's a very, very clear steer, and there's quite a number of references here that the price being paid for site will not be a justification for failing to accord with policy, and on a number of those occasions the government goes as far as to say the price, under no circumstances will the price paid for land be a relevant justification for failing to accord with the relevant policies in the plan. Now of course as public lawyers we all know that you can't make a policy which admits of no exceptions, but that's about as strong as the government can be in saying that that is not what they anticipate happening. And finally, although the government, in my view, has suggested that one can come forward with less detail around large-scale sites, it is still clear that there will need to be site-specific viability assessments for large-scale sites. So paragraph 5 of the viability planning practice guidance talks about plan makers can undertake site-specific viability assessment for sites that are critical to delivering the strategic policies of the plan, including, for example, large sites that provide a significant portion of the plan supply. So that's very likely to apply to any form of strategic extension. So that was a quick overview of the changes that the government's brought about. And I'm going to hand back to Michael, and he's going to look at some examples, all of which I think, Michael, I'm correct in saying, were examined under the 2012 planning practice guidance.
Yes, absolutely. And that is quite an important point to note. So perhaps we can go to the next slide. There is a danger, in a sense, of too much doom and gloom in relation to garden communities, because obviously the recent track record has not been enormously positive in terms of some of the examination inspectors' reports. But it is, I think, quite important to emphasise that thus far, all we have seen is the working out of inspectors applying the guidance in the 2012 version of the NPPF and the 2012 or thereabout supporting versions of the PPG. We haven't yet seen inspectors grappling with the more up-to-date guidance that Claire has summarised for us. So when you look at these examples, you do need to take them with that health warning very much in mind. And I don't think you can necessarily assume that the outcomes under current guidance would have been the same. That's not to say that there can't be valuable lessons learned from those experiences, but I say it is worth keeping that health warning very much in mind. So Uttlesford, which was 3 garden communities being proposed in one very large rural local planning authority area. Those of you who know Uttlesford will know that Saffron Walden, its historic market town, is its main settlement, and various constraints to a historic town of that nature. Then the town of Great Dunmow, and then on its peripheries with its adjacent neighbour Braintree is land in the vicinity of Braintree. And so the local authority had decided to propose 3 garden communities. One of those was effectively cross-boundary, because what Uttlesford called west of Braintree really only worked as a garden community if it was latched onto what the North Essex authorities were proposing in their plan, which we come on to subsequently, as a garden community. The Uttlesford west of Braintree really, as they accepted, made no sense at all as a freestanding proposal. It simply wasn't big enough or connected enough. Then after the plan had been made and submitted, but before the examination started, there was a change of political control. This is one of the parts of the country where residents groups did have electoral success, and a majority grouping, residents for Uttlesford, then became the ruling party, and that obviously gave them a challenge as to what they would do or not do with the local plan, not having been passionate supporters of it through their electoral campaign, but nonetheless they did decide to stick with it. It was quite clear in relation to the garden communities that they were going to be very largely dependent on significant new transport infrastructure, both relationships with the strategic road network, the M11 and the A120, regulated in part by Highways England, and also with Essex County Council in relation to the local road network. The authority was successful in resolving issues to the satisfaction of those statutory bodies on the delivery of the appropriate transport infrastructure. But unfortunately, the inspectors were not so satisfied, and you will see that from their report. But you know, the realistic position being that the infrastructure that was going to be needed would be delayed when you fed in a realistic trajectory of the housing sites that would, when they would come forward. And in a sense, Uttlesford were a victim of their own, as it were, realism, that because they kept pushing things back, recognising that things couldn't happen quite when ideally you would wish them, that then became, in a sense, a bit of a stick to beat them with, because the inspectors were then saying, well, of course, you're not going to get these rapid bus transit routes, you're not going to have the sustainable travel modes that you need to make these sustainable communities until later on in your build periods, and so on and so forth. It did lead to the sustainability being open to question. It was also a particular problem in that case that certainly amongst at least one of the promoters, the local authority and the promoters, they weren't entirely on the same page as to delivery mechanisms and the extent to which there needed to be a subordinate DPD to provide more detail. So you didn't have, in a sense, the people who wanted the thing to happen all, as it were, singing from a common, I probably can't say hymn sheet these days because that's not very PC, but singing from a common agenda of songs for the inspector's benefit. So then perhaps just the next slide on Uttlesford, just to recap. Clearly you can't undermine the importance of the evidence base being adequate to support what is needed and making sure it's clearly explained. Importance of being realistic as well as aspirational in what you're trying to do, securing agreements with key bodies, and probably the penultimate point, flushing out the difficulties early on. Clearly, if there are going to be problems, you've got to engage with them and think about what happens if this doesn't happen on time, what will then that mean for our strategy, and build in flexibility. Uttlesford in particular did have to build in flexibility between, as it were, the pre-submission publication plan and the actual submitted plan, because in between times they were faced with the North Essex inspector's interim findings, which were pouring cold water on the North Essex garden communities at that time. And obviously that then raised a particular question about how they were going to deliver the west of Braintree example. Okay, so then if we then turn to North Essex, so next slide please Claire, thanks. Here, 3 garden communities, but obviously spread over 3 local authority areas. So you've got Braintree, Colchester and Tendring joining together. Effectively they were getting 1 each, although it doesn't quite work out that way in terms of the the local government boundaries. Again, significant new transport infrastructure needed. A12 and A120 both being important, as well as local roads. So again, need for involvement with Highways England as well as the County Council as the local highway authority. The inspector had initial concerns after earlier hearings as part of the examination, so suspended the examination to allow the evidence base to be improved. And very substantial further evidence was prepared to deal with his detailed concerns as they're relayed. The councils, Highways England and the local highway authority were all satisfied that the necessary infrastructure could be delivered over time, albeit some of it was dependent on HIF funding, some of it was dependent on RIS2 funding, and there were obviously uncertainties about government programmes in those matters. But nonetheless, there was a clear pathway where the matters could come through, but nothing was guaranteed, as it were. The inspector in particular probed viability at the hearings, and ultimately the latest position, because as you know that examination is still ongoing, he has supported one of the garden communities but not the others, and the examination is planned to continue with main mods. So then the next slide. Here it's fair to say there was a clash of expectations between the plan making authorities and the inspector, particularly over the issue of what is proportionate evidence. And the LPA view was, if I put it in very simple terms, this is a long-term strategy over an extended period, and it's a high-level plan which will be supported by more detailed plans as subordinate DPDs. So it's inevitable with such a high-level plan over a long period of time that there will be things we don't know at the moment and which will have to be settled in due course. The inspector's approach was, in sense, say, I agree with you, it's a long-term strategy, but then I part company because I say it's a long-term strategy which is going to set the framework for a long period of time. This is going to establish the principle of these garden communities, and therefore it needs to have adequate evidence to show that that's the right decision and these are in the right place at this time, because the subordinate documents won't be revisiting that issue of principle. So that's where you had a problem. The extent to which the revised guidance on what is proportionate and how you manage that tension will have to be played out. But it does seem to me that the inspector's approach was probably unduly rigorous in what could realistically be expected to be shown at the plan making stage. And after all, when we planned the new towns and Milton Keynes and Stevenage and so on, it certainly wasn't the case that we had chapter and verse at that stage. Other points just to pick up on: avoid overcomplication, choose your battles, i.e. don't make, in a sense, every issue that you're arguing for an issue where you're pushing at the envelope. Use established methodologies where you can. Less is more. The only point there is, in fact, as it were, bizarrely, the site promoter who had the lowest profile at the examination is the one whose project seems likely to be finding favour with the inspector, and those who provided voluminous evidence were the ones that the inspector found the evidence provided more questions than it answered. And then I say work with what you've got just means be realistic in how you plan your strategy. Right, now we're going to take a leap into the brave new world, and hopefully with the seamless integration of technology, we will shortly be moving to Wayne's presentation. and that is something which I think should work. Oh yes, here we are. I think we've now got matters, and we should soon go, I think, hopefully to the large screen, and Wayne will take over. Here we are. Yeah. I think Wayne's speaking. I'm not sure whether we've got the volume. I think, Carolina, maybe because you're on mute. Carolina, I think maybe you need to demute yourself in order for us to hear Wayne. No, I think we've frozen in time for a moment.
I am stuck.
Oh, there we are. Yep. Let's go.
Morning, everyone. And sorry I can't be there to present this part of the webinar live. I am stuck elsewhere in virtual examination sessions. But it's my pleasure to be part of the last in the present series of Cornerstone Barristers Local Plan webinars. And as I'm pre-recording this, it comes to you with all the usual disclaimers about barristers and their use of technology. But hopefully this part of the session will all pass off smoothly. I will not be available today to answer any questions that arise on my specific part of the presentation. Michael and Claire will be there to field your questions, but if anyone has any specific questions that they'd like to address to me, then by all means send them in by email and I will endeavour to answer them as soon as I can. For my part of today's talk, I want to talk about two particular case studies in relation to garden communities, which throw up a number of issues for discussion related to the evidence base that needs to be available to support garden community proposals, relating to the role of statutory consultees and to the fluidity of the emerging local plan process, which is coming into particular focus at the moment with the changes that may be important to some authorities as a result of the new information on population and household projections. And so, by way of introduction, my first slide shows Dunsfold Aerodrome, more commonly known nowadays as Dunsfold Park, and an aerial photograph of the aerodrome before proposed development and one indicative way in which the site could be developed to provide substantial levels of new housing together with employment land and other ancillary land uses. And so Dunsfold Aerodrome was a key plank of the now successfully adopted Waverley Local Plan Part 1. Part 2 is currently going through preparation for the examination process, and that will deal with some of the less strategic matters of Part 1 having dealt with large strategic allocations that needed to be made and other matters of that kind. And it was made against what is not an unusual situation for authorities in that part of the world, and acknowledged their pressing need for housing and a serious issue in relation to affordable housing. And in that context, the inspector described, both in his report and elsewhere, this allocation as an excellent opportunity for meeting the needs of the authority. And he described the decision as a brave one being made by the local authority. And it's worth spending a moment to reflect on that observation, which I found a particularly interesting one. Because as those experienced in the field will know, with a number of the garden communities that are coming forward, there may often be broad support across the area of the local planning authority for these kinds of proposals. But locally, there will often be very intense criticism, vociferous criticism of what is being proposed. And that can lead to serious political pressure, and in a number of examples that has led to differences in administration following on from the progression of these kinds of proposals through the local plan process. So I agree with the inspector's characterisation of the Dunsfold decision as being a brave one. And there is an underlying point about the extent to which central government might be more explicit in carrying through its support for those in local government who are charged with making these very difficult decisions at the moment, as to where garden communities, which are often necessary in order to meet levels of housing need, might be placed. And one of the things the inspector in the Waverley case also did was conducted some useful comparisons by reference to other sites that were coming forward providing garden community types of accommodation. And so it's a useful report to see what can be taken as being some very positive potential elements of a new proposed garden community. And there, whilst there was a significant amount of PDL land outside Greenbelt, and Waverley is at just above 61% Greenbelt, there were AONB implications in relation to the site and other difficulties with it. One of the principal difficulties with bringing the site forward related to a previous decision by the Secretary of State that the site was in an inherently unsustainable location, and that might be thought to be quite an unpromising basis upon which to seek to build a new garden community. But the way that that was overcome was by reference to the national guidance, which remains extant in the 2019 NPPF, that developments of this size should be in locations that are sustainable or that can be made sustainable through appropriate changes to infrastructure. In this case, there were two key changes to the infrastructure, one related to the roads and significant improvements along the A281 corridor, but the other, and perhaps key, was the provision of public transport by way of bus services that were secured in perpetuity by a particular form of drafting within the Section 106 agreement. And that was something that both the planning inspector, who reported on the planning permission that was ultimately granted in relation to the site, and indeed the Secretary of State were prepared to accept. And so there it is in this case both very useful decisions by the Secretary of State and more detailed analysis by the inspector, but also those decisions in the High Court dealing with the Dunsfold challenge, and also in the Court of Appeal insofar as there were continuing challenges to the Waverley local plan process. So all of that learning is there for consideration. And so just to run through some key reasons why Dunsfold was successful. Firstly, in terms of land ownership, there was a relatively simple position there, and so coordination of multiple landowners was not a particular issue as far as Dunsfold was concerned. The relative unsustainability of the site without improvement was recognised early on as a result of the Secretary of State's decision making, and so there was very robust traffic material in front of both the local plan and in front of the inspector considering the call-in inquiry that ran not quite in parallel, but nearly in parallel with that. And so there was a demonstrated ability to meet the infrastructure requirements so as to make the site location sustainable and therefore consistent with national guidance and overcoming the previous concerns of the Secretary of State. I've already referred to the amount of PDL, but the size of the site as well was an important feature in demonstrating that it could be viable with the level of contributions required for the infrastructure. And the site also had the benefit of very significant levels of existing employment provision, which was going to be further strengthened by the development, leading to increased levels of internalisation over time. So that assisted the sustainability case very significantly as well. And ultimately all of this led to the proposal at Dunsfold being clearly supported by the local planning authority. And so we take away from Dunsfold one example of what was clearly a more than proportionate evidence base to support the allocation and ultimately permission on that site. As I've said, those proposals were in gestation for some time based on the Secretary of State's previous refusal, which was undoubtedly helpful in terms of knowing what the evidence needed to tackle. And the outline scheme came forward in near parallel with the emerging local plan process, which meant that there was a far greater level of detailed reports than might commonly be available at the emerging local plan stage otherwise. So the upshot of all of that was a wealth of evidence in support of the allocation. And then moving on to my second example, which is a more recent examination still continuing in relation to the South Godstone garden community within Tandridge District Council. And again, that garden community comes forward as a key plank within the emerging local plan examination, proposing to provide some 1,400 units within the plan period, and South Godstone is located geographically, centrally within Tandridge District Council. Now, Tandridge has a very high level of constraint, in particular in relation to Greenbelt, where it has the highest concentration in the country, currently standing at around 94%. And in those circumstances, a very sharp issue arises as to the need to have an appropriate mechanism for securing in principle acceptability of the removal of a site of this potential size from the Greenbelt, and that in principle acceptability may be important to obtain before it can be expected that private landowners will fund what may be very complex and very detailed sets of studies into a number of issues that will need to be resolved for the final and successful implementation of the garden community. Now, South Godstone Garden Community was recognised by central government within the garden communities programme as meeting the key qualities of a garden village, and therefore one that was capable of being an exemplar, and so it stands in very good stead in that respect. And one of the reasons for that is that it has the benefit of very significant infrastructure in place already, namely the train station at South Godstone, which has a number of important connections through to London and elsewhere. And one of the things that happened in the emergence of the Tandridge local plan was that this location was identified out of a potential range of some 22 areas for a garden community, and that was done by a detailed series of studies over the years, gradually whittling those proposals down to what was likely to be the most sustainable option to take forward within the examination process. And so the way that the local authority dealt with this very sharp issue that arises is the way that is perhaps the best available mechanism on the statutory framework as it currently stands. And that was for the garden community to be brought forward in more detail with its own area action plan, which would have its own issues and options stage, its own submission and examination. Of course, that examination would take place under the 2019 NPPF, Tandridge being one of the examples of the transitional plans, where the main examination is taking place under the 2012 provisions. And so the approach of having the area action plan allows for there to be an in principle acceptability of the removal of this land from the green belt, but leaving some parameters over for later finalisation based on more detailed evidence studies, so that the scheme can be made as compliant as possible with national guidance and still provide the levels of housing that Tandridge needs. And the council, as part of that process, where there was a far more disparate position in relation to land assembly than was evident at Dunsfold Aerodrome, is proposing to be actively involved in land assembly to the extent that that becomes necessary. And the garden community, again, was supported by detailed viability information put before the inspector. But the current position is an interesting one, as much as the South Godstone Garden community was also the subject of a housing infrastructure fund bid to seek to improve elements of the scheme as they might come forward. And in relation to that HIF funding bid, the bid ultimately in this round of bidding was not successful, and so the inspector is currently making further inquiries as to what the implications are for that in relation to the garden village. But the extent of his concern identified in current letters relates to the highways issues, where the HIF funding was potentially coming forward to assist with addressing elements of the infrastructure package. And what he is concerned to address, as it appears from his correspondence, is when there might be a severe impact on junction 6 of the M25, so that there can be a more precise calibration of the extent to which the garden community can provide housing within the plan period, and how early within the plan period. And so the lessons that we take from these two examples are firstly that there is a key point about the proportionality of the evidence base, and inspectors being prepared in garden community cases to apply that test of proportionality in a pragmatic way, recognising, in particular in cases like Greenbelt and potentially some other categories of case, that the evidence base will not be and should not be that would be available even at the stage of either an outline permission being sought or indeed at the area action plan stage. And in those circumstances, a useful test to go back to is the one that inspectors do use, and that is of the showstopper approach, to stand back and ask, on consideration of the viability evidence and all of the other evidence supporting a garden community, whether or not there is truly an evident showstopper to the process, or whether it should be allowed to be carried forward as being the will of the local planning authority, developed doubtless during a number of iterations of public consultation. And so one of the reasons for adopting that kind of pragmatic approach is that, as we know, there is now the obligation for review within the regulations. And so if there are truly unexpected difficulties with the garden communities coming forward, then there is a relatively ready-made way of addressing those issues insofar as it may be necessary through the review process. And I suggest that three of the important lessons that arise from the two case studies that I've looked at are, first of all, there is a case for considering mechanisms to facilitate early, in principle, acceptance of developments of the size of garden communities through the emerging local plan process. There is also a case for more detailed guidance from the central government as to what may normally be considered to be sufficient and proportionate in terms of the evidence base for the garden communities which are coming forward, because it's clear from examination sessions that I've been involved in that there is a level of disagreement about where that standard can appropriately be met and where the lines ought to be drawn. And lastly, there is, in my view, a clear case for central government providing more direct and explicit support for those local politicians who are charged with making these very difficult and often unpopular decisions, and for there to be clear guidance about the need for local authorities and local councillors to stand behind submitted plans from the date of submission. If those cases are considered, then it's possible that there may be some more robust guidance allowing for better prospects for garden communities, which are sorely needed in a number of areas, a number of greenbelt areas in particular, in order to meet what are likely levels of housing demand coming forward. And that can happen in this round of local planning and indeed through the next round of local planning as well. And that concludes my part of the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed, Wayne. That is a very helpful and illuminating narrative through the issues that arose, both going back to Waverley and then also more recently in Tandridge. and I think Claire in particular would echo the views about the issues at junction 6 of the M25. It might be that during the lockdown world, traffic conditions aren't severe every day at the moment, but I think you would certainly echo that, that concern. Right, well, we were going to turn to the Q&A. I'm conscious of the time. We haven't actually had, other than some logistical questions, which I think we've tried to deal with, matters particularly coming up this morning, but we have had a number in your earlier comments. So I'm just going to pick on some of those for further comments. Some of them are fairly high level. Some of them are, in a sense, the reverse of high level. Somebody's obviously got a very specific problem, and I'm not going to attempt to offer any views about things which get down to fine detail, because obviously this is a general presentation. I mean, there's a number of questions about, you know, the amount of evidence, the detail it needs to go into, and the proportionality issue, which we've covered already in the presentation. I mean, I think I would certainly echo the point that Wayne made about the benefits of further guidance. I know we have got some people from GLD, MHCLG participating, and if there's something that they want to take back, which is the benefits of clarity in the guidance. Obviously, everybody appreciates that the inspectors are carrying out an independent examination of a plan, and that the inspectors are independent, exercising their own planning judgment. But that always has to happen in the context of a clear framework of guidance. And what is certainly beneficial would be guidance to effectively enshrine the no showstoppers approach, which has been used in the jargon, but isn't always the approach that's applied by some inspectors in some of their decisions. And essentially, if you want to know the answer, well, what evidence do we need? What you need is enough to persuade your particular examination inspector. And I'm sometimes reminded that there was a William Blake, that great English poet, did say in one of his Songs of Innocence, "You never know what is enough until you know what is more than enough." And in a sense, there's some truth in that, that you need to think, well, you know, it may be that we go slightly beyond where we need to go, but if we do that, we will be providing the inspector with what he or she needs. There was a question particularly about, in terms of viability and the use of escalator clauses or review mechanisms generally. And I think that attitudes on that are changing, and there can be a legitimate role for matters, particularly when you're dealing with the delivery of affordable housing, not really as a way of watering down what is committed, but saying, well, given that there are some certainly uncertainties, and there will be uncertainties about sales values for development over the long period of time, that if a development proves to be more valuable as it moves forward, then that could be a good reason why the amount of affordable housing should be sought to be closer reflective of the needs than might have been affordable at the very outset for understandable viability reasons. So I think there is a role for escalator clauses on obligations and review mechanisms in relation to affordable housing. There was a question, I think, which was put about how do you deliver infrastructure in an area which is significantly constrained, particularly problems of contaminated land and so on. And I'm afraid, you know, the short answer is that garden communities and infrastructure delivery, there isn't, as it were, a magic wand which will enable you to get a quart out of a pint pot. You know, there clearly are government funds that can be bid for, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, Housing Infrastructure Fund being a key one in this context. But you know, realistically, if you need more infrastructure improvement than a development can afford, and local authorities clearly have got to get best value in terms of their own investments, etc., it's not going to be possible to achieve all of your ambition, and you've got to work in a sense with what you've got and the constraints that presents. I think there was also an interesting question that was asked by one authority about education and the extent to which infrastructure providers can, as it were, deliver the infrastructure that might be needed to support growth, and then subsequently seek to recover that from developers who are bringing forward that growth. Now, as you will know, in a SIL context, there are mechanisms whereby if you set it up right in your SIL charging schedule, you can include amongst the infrastructure that you're expecting to be funded from SIL, infrastructure which has already been provided. But that's a specific instance and a particular circumstance that arises through SIL. I think more widely, unless you have very clearly established a framework in your development plan with the right policy hooks, let's say, to an IDP, an infrastructure delivery plan, which enables that kind of retrospective recovery, you will face a particular difficulty, because obviously regulation 122 of the SIL regulations, the one that relates to being able to take into account as a material factor planning obligations as a reason for granting planning permission. The first of those tests is that the decision maker has to be satisfied that the relevant obligation is necessary to make the development in question acceptable in planning terms. And in very simple terms, if the improvement has already happened, if the infrastructure has already been provided and isn't going to be taken away, regardless of what happens to the development site, then it's not going to be terribly easy to demonstrate that the obligation to, as it were, repay the infrastructure provider is something that is necessary to make the development acceptable, because the development will still be able to get the benefit of that infrastructure whether the developer puts his hand in his pocket or not. So I say there is a real problem there, and it's a problem which is best dealt with either through SIL or through plan making. Claire, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add on any of the points. I see that was a slight shake of a no.
No, so, not particularly. I mean, obviously, attempted to address we had many questions about the level of detail to be provided, and I obviously attempted to address that insofar as we can at the moment, without the benefit of inspectors and courts' decisions on the guidance through my presentation.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you very much to everybody for participating and attending. Wayne has already offered, perhaps unwisely, to answer all of your emails. So any of you that want to fire off an email to Wayne, feel free, and possibly if you fire off an email to the Claire and me, we might be able to help you. But this is a general seminar, webinar. It's not, as it were, an opportunity to bring out all your individual specific problems. But thank you all very much for participating. Stay safe, and I hope that things carry on moving forward. Thank you.